Walter Briggs snatched the dented tin off the counter and slammed it down so hard the whole store shook. "You think I run a charity?" he barked, loud enough that every customer in the shop turned to stare. "Look at this. Dented on two sides. Lid's been pried. You've already opened it, haven't you?" He shoved the tin across the counter toward Caleb Whitmore. "I don't take back damaged goods. That's your problem now." Caleb stood there with his baby wrapped against his chest, the boy so bundled in rags you could barely see his face. One small fist had worked its way free of the wrapping and hung in the cold air, the fingers curled and pale. "Sir, I haven't opened it," Caleb said quietly. "It came that way from your shelf. I only noticed when I got home." "Then you should have checked before you bought it." Briggs pointed at the door. "Pay what you owe or get out of my store." The baby made a sound, not quite a cry, more like a question, soft and exhausted. And Caleb pressed his hand against the child's back without thinking, the way fathers do without knowing they're doing it. If you've ever watched someone be humiliated for simply trying to keep their child alive, stay with me. Because what happens next in this store is going to change everything. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that store in Denver, 1888, and to the moment one woman's decision cracked open a world neither of them expected. The cold that settled over Denver in the winter of 1888 was not the kind that simply made you uncomfortable. It was the kind that made decisions for you. It told you which meals to skip, which rooms to abandon, which hopes to fold up and put away for a season that might never come. Caleb Whitmore had been making those kinds of decisions for 4 months by the time he pushed open the door to Briggs General Store on a Tuesday afternoon in February. He was 31 years old and looked 40. Not because he was frail, he was broad through the shoulders, with hands that had spent years gripping pickaxes and hauling ore carts through the mines east of the city. But grief had a way of sitting on a man's face, settling into the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. And Caleb had been carrying grief since the previous October when his wife, Margaret, had died 12 hours after giving birth to their son. The doctors had called it a hemorrhage. There was nothing anyone could have done. Caleb had been in the hall outside the room when it happened, and by the time the nurse came out to find him, Margaret had already gone. He'd been allowed to go in and sit with her for a while. He didn't remember much of that hour. He remembered the sound the candle made in the draft from the window, and he remembered that her hand was still warm for longer than he expected. After that, he had Noah. And Noah was the whole of it. The baby was colicky and small, born a few weeks before he should have been, according to the midwife who'd helped with the delivery. For the first month, Caleb had barely slept, sitting up through the night in the chair beside the crib, listening to make sure the boy was breathing. He lost his job at the Consolidated Mine in December. Not because of something he did wrong, but because a section of the East Tunnel collapsed and they were cutting the crew. Caleb was among the last hired and among the first let go. He'd been told it wasn't personal. He'd nodded and walked out into the snow without his coat because he'd left it in the tunnel and he wasn't going back for it. By February, he had sold most of what he and Margaret had accumulated in 3 years of marriage. The good chair. The clock her mother had given them. The spare tools. He kept her sewing basket because he couldn't bring himself to part with it, and he kept the crib. And he kept a tin coffee pot that didn't work properly, but that he'd bought her as a joke the first winter they were together. She'd laughed and made him promise to fix the spout. He never had. He walked into Briggs General Store with Noah against his chest, and a dented tin of baby milk under his arm, and $2.11 in his coat pocket, the last of what he had. The tin had cost him $1.80 3 days before. He'd noticed the dent when he got home, but hadn't thought much of it. Then he opened it and found the milk inside had gone slightly sour. Not dangerously, but enough that Noah turned his face away and cried until Caleb walked him up and down the one-room apartment for an hour. He'd watered it down and gotten the boy to take some, but the rest had gone bad by morning. He was not coming back for an argument. He was coming back because he had no other choice. The store was busy for a Tuesday. 3 women near the fabric bolts, 2 men he didn't recognize looking at rope and hardware, and a woman he'd seen somewhere before standing near the back wall with a basket over one arm, her face turned toward the shelves of canned goods. She was dressed well, better than most people in this part of Denver, in a dark wool coat and gloves that still had their shape. She didn't look at him when he came in. Walter Briggs was behind the counter. He was a wide man in his mid-50s with a red face that went redder when he was irritated, which seemed to be most of the time. He'd built the store 20 years ago and ran it with the particular authority of a man who believed that owning something entitled him to the temperament of a tyrant. Caleb set the tin on the counter. Briggs looked at it. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he reached out and turned the tin slowly, examining the dents the way a judge examines evidence. "What's this about?" "I bought that 3 days ago," Caleb said. "It was already dented when I got home. The milk inside was bad." "That's so." "Yes, sir. My son couldn't take it. I'd like to exchange it for a good one, or get my money back." Briggs picked up the tin, turned it again, and set it down with that deliberate slam that made the women at the fabric bolts look over. "You've opened it," he said, "to feed my son. Yes, that's what I bought it for." "So it's used." "It was bad. I couldn't use it. The milk had turned." "Your word against the tin's condition when you left this store." Briggs crossed his arms. "I've got no way of knowing what happened between here and wherever you live. Could have dropped it. Could have stored it wrong." "I stored it in the same temperature you've got it stored here," Caleb said, and he kept his voice level because he was aware of the people watching, and because he had learned that anger was a thing you couldn't afford when you had nothing. "My apartment is cold, sir. Very cold. Nothing in it is going to spoil faster than it would on that shelf." Briggs's face had gone through its progressions. It was in the dark red stage now. "I don't run a charity," he said, loud enough for the room. "If you can't afford good goods, don't buy them." "I paid for good goods. You sold me something that wasn't." "I don't know that." "Then I'm telling you." The word hung in the cold store air. Caleb could feel Noah's weight against his chest, feel the faint movement of the boy's breathing through all the layers of wrapping. The small fist had come loose from the swaddling and was hanging there in the open air. Briggs leaned forward on the counter. "You want to know what I know? I know you came in here 3 days ago, and you counted out your coins like a man spending his last dollar. I know this tin has been opened and filled with God knows what and brought back to me. And I know that if I take it back, I'll be out both the milk and the money, and I am not a charity, Mr. Whitmore." "Mr. Whitmore." He pushed the tin back across the counter. "Take your tin. Pay your debt for a new one or get out of my store." The two men near the hardware had turned around. One of them had the decency to look uncomfortable. The other was watching with the flat curiosity of someone watching a dogfight. Caleb did not move. He stood there with his hand on the dented tin and his son against his chest, and his $2.11 in his pocket, and he did the arithmetic that he had already done a dozen times on the walk over. A new tin of milk was $1.80. He had $2.11. If he spent it on milk, he had 31 cents left. Rent was already 6 weeks past due. Firewood was $2 a cord, and the room was cold enough that he could see his breath. He'd been burning what scraps he could find in the streets for 3 weeks. 31 cents would not get him far. He picked up the tin. He turned it in his hands, and he looked at it the way a man looks at something that represents everything that's gone wrong, all compressed into one dented piece of metal, and he felt something behind his eyes that he refused to allow. "Fine," he said. He set the tin back down. He reached into his pocket and counted out $1.80 in coins and placed them on the counter without another word. Briggs swept them up. Caleb took the new tin from the shelf. He checked it for dents before he took it down, and turned toward the door. He had gotten 3 steps when a voice behind him said, "Wait." It was not a loud voice. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because it was accustomed to being listened to. He stopped. The woman in the dark wool coat had moved from the back wall to the counter. She set her basket down and looked at Briggs with the calm, precise attention of someone who had been following every word of the preceding conversation. "How much does he owe you?" she said. Briggs blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The total. What does this man owe you, including the original purchase?" She did not look at Caleb. She was looking at Briggs with a patient, almost clinical expression that seemed to unsettle him in a way Caleb's anger had not. "Ma'am, this is not—" "I know it isn't my business," she said pleasantly. "I'm making it my business." "How much?" Briggs told her. She reached into her coat and produced a small purse and set a single gold coin on the counter. It was larger than anything Caleb had put down. It sat there between them and caught the light from the front window. "That should cover it," she said. "And then some." Use the difference to replace the faulty tin so it isn't sold to someone else. Briggs looked at the coin. He looked at her. He picked up the coin. Caleb turned around. He looked at the woman for the first time properly. She was perhaps in her late 40s, with dark hair shot through with gray at the temples, and a face that had the particular quality of someone who had learned not to let things show on it and had been doing so for so long that the composure had become its own kind of expression. She was not looking at him with pity. That was the first thing he noticed. She was looking at him with something more like assessment, the way a person looks at a situation they are deciding how to handle. "I don't want charity," Caleb said. The words came out more sharply than he intended. "I'm not offering it," she said. She picked up her basket. "I'm correcting an injustice. Those are different things. They feel the same from where I'm standing." She looked at him steadily. "Then you're standing in the wrong place." Noah made a small sound inside his wrappings. Not a cry, just that soft, questioning noise that infants make when they're aware of something changing around them without knowing what. The woman's eyes went to the bundle against Caleb's chest, just for a moment, and something crossed her face so quickly he almost missed it. Something that looked like a flinch, not from discomfort, but from the opposite, from recognition. "That child needs warmth and food," she said, and her voice was slightly different when she said it. Not softer exactly, but less armored. "So do you. You don't have to call it charity. Call it a debt you'll pay when you're able." "I don't know if I'll be able." "Neither do I," she said simply. "That's what makes it a risk rather than a transaction." She adjusted the basket on her arm and moved toward the door. "My name is Vivian Ashford. I have a property on the north side of the city, and I've been trying to find someone with a back and a conscience to help restore the groundskeeper's cottage on the edge of the land. It's been empty 3 winters, and it's showing. The job pays fair wages and comes with use of the cottage itself." She paused with her hand on the door. "If you'd rather freeze to death in a point of pride, that's your decision. If you'd rather work for what your son needs, you know where to find me." She walked out without waiting for an answer. Caleb stood in the middle of Walter Briggs's general store with his baby against his chest and a new tin of milk in his hand and the particular disorienting sensation of a man who has just been handed a door he wasn't looking for. Briggs was already moving to the next customer with the studied efficiency of a man who had decided the incident was over. The 2 men near the hardware had gone back to their rope. Outside the window, he could see Vivian Ashford moving down the street with her basket, not hurrying, not looking back. She walked like a woman who was done with a thing once she'd done it, certain and unhurried. He looked down at the tin in his hand. He looked at Noah's small, pale fist curled in the cold air. He had 31 cents left. He buttoned the fist back into the wrappings. It took 3 tries because his own hands were numb. And he pushed open the door and went out into the February cold of Denver. He caught up with her half a block from the store. "The cottage," he said when he was beside her. "I'd want to see it before I agreed to anything." Vivian didn't break her stride. "Of course. And I need to know what fair wages means to you specifically, because fair means different things to different people." $11 a month, she said, with a food allowance in addition. Wood is on the property. There's a stand of timber on the north edge that needs to be cleared anyway. Caleb did the arithmetic. $11 was not wealth. It was not what he had made at the mine. But $11 and a roof and a wood supply was the difference between his son making it through the winter and not. "I need to be able to bring my son," he said. "I assumed you would." They walked half a block in silence. The wind came down the street from the mountains and pushed against them both. "Why?" he asked. "Why what?" "Why me? You don't know me." Vivian walked a few more steps before she answered. "I know you counted out your last coins without flinching, and then you looked at that tin like it had let you down personally, and then you said fine and counted out your last coins again." She shifted the basket. "That tells me more than a reference letter. It tells you I'm broke. It tells me you don't quit when things are unreasonable," she said, "which is the only quality that matters for the work I need done." Caleb said nothing to that. They reached the corner where her carriage was waiting, a well-kept black one with a driver up top who straightened when he saw her. She stopped and turned to look at Caleb in the flat winter light. The assessment was back on her face. "Tomorrow morning," she said, 7 o'clock. "I'll send the carriage for you. What's your address?" He told her. She nodded once, the way a person nods when they've noted something and filed it, and she got into the carriage, and the driver clicked the horses forward without ceremony. Caleb stood on the corner and watched it go. The cold was settling in harder as the afternoon light dropped, and he could feel Noah beginning to stir against his chest, the particular restlessness that meant the boy was hungry. He had a tin of milk and a possible job and 31 cents and a dead wife and a son who was too small and too young to know how precarious everything was. He turned back toward the apartment. He did not let himself think too much about Vivian Ashford or what tomorrow morning might mean. Thinking about possibilities was a luxury you paid for in disappointment, and he had run out of room for disappointment a while ago. But he held the tin of milk a little more carefully on the walk home. And when Noah made that small questioning sound inside the wrappings, Caleb tucked his chin down and said, quietly, into the bundle of cloth, "I know. Just a little while longer." It was not a promise he could keep with certainty, but he made it anyway. The carriage came at 7, exactly as she'd said. Caleb had been awake since 4:30, not because Noah had kept him up. The boy had actually slept better than usual, maybe because the new milk had been clean and whole, but because he couldn't stop running the numbers. $11 a month. Wood on the property. Use of the cottage. He'd done the arithmetic on the back of an envelope until the pencil wore down to nothing, and every time he added it up, it came out the same: survivable. Not comfortable. Not safe in any permanent sense. But survivable, which was a distance from where he'd been standing yesterday in Briggs's store. He had Noah bundled and ready by 6:15 and spent the remaining 45 minutes sitting on the edge of the bed doing nothing in particular, which was its own kind of exhaustion. The driver was a quiet man named Prentice, who didn't ask questions and didn't make conversation, which Caleb appreciated. They rode north through the city as it was waking up. Bread carts and coal wagons, a woman shaking a rug out a second-floor window, 2 dogs arguing over something in an alley. And then the streets thinned and the city gave way to the particular in-between territory that frontier towns always had on their edges, where the buildings got farther apart and the land started reasserting itself. The Ashford property was not what he expected. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, exactly. Something more manicured, maybe. Something that matched the quality of her coat and gloves. What he found instead was a substantial piece of land that had clearly been impressive at some point and was now in the particular condition of a place that had been left to its own devices for too long. The main house was large and well built, with good bones and a porch that ran the full length of the front, but the steps needed work and the paint on the shutters had been peeling for at least 2 winters. The grounds around it were overgrown in an organized way, as if someone had once planted everything deliberately and then stopped tending it, but the plants had continued on stubbornly, regardless. The cottage was on the north edge of the property, past a stand of cottonwood trees that had dropped their leaves months ago and stood now like gray arithmetic against the white sky. It was a solid structure, stone foundation, timber frame, but the roof had taken damage from the last heavy snow, and one of the window shutters had come off its hinges and been propped against the wall beside the front door, where it had presumably stood for some time. Vivian was already there when the carriage arrived, standing in front of the cottage with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the sagging roofline with an expression that was less dismayed than calculating. "It's worse than I told you," she said when he climbed down. "I can see that. The roof is the first problem. Everything else is secondary." She walked to the corner of the building and pointed upward. "There's a section over the east room where the support beam has shifted. I had a carpenter look at it in October. He said it was manageable if addressed before the next hard snow." "Has there been a hard snow since October?" 2. Caleb looked at the roofline. He looked at the corner she was pointing at. He looked at the general condition of the place with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years working in structures where a failure meant something falling on your head. "It's fixable," he said. "That's what I thought. It won't be quick." "I'm not in a hurry," she said. "I'm in a need." Noah had started to stir inside his wrappings. Caleb adjusted the boy against his chest, and the motion drew Vivian's eyes for just a moment before she looked back at the cottage. "There's a room off the main space that would work for a nursery," she said. Her voice was practical. "The stove in the main room still draws. I had Prentice get it lit this morning." Caleb looked at her. "You did that before you knew if I'd take the job." "I did it because regardless of whether you took the job, you were coming here in the cold with an infant." She turned and went toward the cottage door. "Come inside. I'll show you what needs doing." The inside was cold but improving. The stove was working and the room was holding the heat as it built. The main room was bigger than his entire apartment. The floor was solid hardwood, dusty and unswept but intact. There was a table, 3 chairs, a set of shelves, and a stone fireplace that would need cleaning before it could be used safely. The smaller room off the back had a window that faced east, and the morning light came through it in a long, flat rectangle across the floor. He stood in that smaller room with Noah against his chest and looked at the window and the light on the floor and felt something move through him that he didn't have a name for immediately. It took him a moment to identify it. It was the particular vertigo of a future becoming possible. He'd stopped imagining futures for a while. The sensation was almost unpleasant because of how unfamiliar it was. "The nursery," Vivian said from the doorway. "Yes," he said. She left him there for a moment and went back to the main room, and he heard her moving around in there, checking things, the practical inventory of someone who approaches problems by cataloging them. He appreciated that she didn't hover. They spent an hour going through the cottage together. The roof damage, the chimney, the window that needed a new frame on the northeast corner, the section of floor near the back door that had warped from moisture and would need to be replaced before it became a hazard. Caleb took mental notes and asked specific questions, and Vivian answered them with specifics, not generalities, which told him she had actually looked at the place properly before his arrival, rather than just waving her hand at the general problem. By the time they were done, Noah had gotten genuinely hungry and started crying with the particular focused determination that infants have when they've decided the world has neglected them long enough. "I need to feed him," Caleb said, a little stiffly, because asking for the pause felt like an admission of something. "Of course," Vivian gestured at the table. "I brought provisions. They're in the bag by the stove." He hadn't noticed the bag. Inside it was a portion of bread, some cheese, a jar of broth, and a smaller tin of good milk, a sealed, undamaged one, along with a folded piece of cloth that turned out to be a clean feeding towel. He looked at all of it for a moment longer than he should have. "You thought of everything," he said. "I thought of what an infant needs," she said simply, and moved to the window to give him something resembling privacy while he sorted out Noah's feeding. It was while he was managing the tin and the towel and the squirming, outraged baby that he made his decision, not from gratitude. He was careful about gratitude because gratitude could make you stupid, but from the same cold arithmetic he'd been running since 4:30 that morning. The job was real. The cottage was real. The work was within his abilities. And whatever Vivian Ashford's motivations were, they were producing practical outcomes, which was more than he could say for most things in his life at the moment. "I'll take the job," he said, without looking up from Noah. "Good," she said from the window. Nothing more than that. He moved into the cottage 4 days later, which was how long it took to end his arrangement with the apartment landlord. A conversation that required no negotiation because he was 6 weeks behind, and the landlord was transparently relieved to have him go, and to transport the few things he owned, which fit in the back of Prentice's wagon with considerable room to spare. The first week was purely logistical. He cleared the chimney, which had a bird's nest in it the size of a small armchair. He cleaned the stovepipes and the fireplace. He did a temporary repair on the worst section of the roof using timber he found in a lean-to at the back of the property, enough to stop the immediate damage while he assessed what a permanent repair would take. He found the stand of timber Vivian had mentioned on the north edge and spent 2 full days splitting wood until his shoulders ached in a way that felt productive rather than depleting. Vivian came by the cottage every second or third day. She didn't hover then either. She would look at what had been done, ask 1 or 2 specific questions, and either nod or suggest an adjustment. She never praised effusively, and she never criticized harshly. She operated at a level of even assessment that Caleb found simultaneously refreshing and slightly unnerving, as if the room's temperature stayed exactly the same regardless of what was happening in it. Noah liked her. That was the part that caught Caleb off guard. The boy was not easy with strangers. He had a particular wariness around new faces that the midwife had said was normal for an infant, a kind of careful watching before he decided how to feel. But from the first time Vivian came by and leaned over to look at him in his crib, a makeshift one Caleb had built from a wooden crate and some padding, Noah had looked back at her with that serious, measuring quality infants have, and then apparently decided something in her favor, because he'd reached up and grabbed her finger with the focused enthusiasm of someone making a claim. Vivian had gone very still. She'd let the boy hold her finger for a moment longer than was probably necessary for the situation, her face doing that thing it did where it almost showed something and then pulled back. Then she'd straightened and said, "His grip is strong," and moved on to asking about the chimney. But she started coming by more often after that. Not every day, and not for long visits, but the pattern shifted from every second or third day to most days, and the visits lengthened slightly, in the particular incremental way that people change behaviors they're not admitting they're changing. It was on a Thursday afternoon in the third week. The weather had broken slightly, giving them 4 days of pale, exhausted sunshine that made the snow recede enough to see the ground in patches. That Caleb came inside from the timber stand to find Vivian in the cottage, sitting in one of the chairs near the stove with Noah in her arms. She didn't look startled. She looked like a woman who had decided to do something and had made her peace with it before he arrived. "He was fussing," she said. "He fusses." "I know." She adjusted the baby slightly. She wasn't awkward with him, which surprised Caleb more than her presence did. She held him with a kind of careful, experienced ease that suggested she had held infants before, and held them for real reasons, not just for the performed affection people sometimes offered at social occasions. Caleb hung up his coat and stood near the stove to warm his hands. He didn't say anything, and after a moment Vivian said, without looking up from Noah, "I had a son." The wordhead was doing a lot of work in that sentence. He recognized it from the inside, the specific grammar of loss, the shift from present to past tense that you learned to use without making a ceremony of it, because making a ceremony of it was how you came apart. "How old?" he asked. 3. She kept her eyes on Noah's face. "It was 11 years ago, a fever. 4 days from perfectly healthy to gone." She paused. "My husband went 2 years after. His heart. I'm sorry." "Yes." She said it without the particular performance that people sometimes attach to that word when they received condolences. No gracious dismissal, no rush to change the subject, just acknowledgement. "I learned to be alone," she said. "I got good at it. Good enough that it stopped feeling like a deficit." She glanced up at him briefly. "And then this one grabbed my finger." Caleb sat down in the other chair. They sat there for a while with the stove going and the afternoon light coming flat through the west window, and Noah fell asleep between sentences. It was the most honest conversation he'd had with another person since Margaret died. Not because they said enormous things. Most of what was said was small and practical and on the surface about nothing more than the cottage and the work ahead. But there was a quality to it, a lack of performance, that felt rare. Vivian was not trying to comfort him, and he was not trying to impress her, and neither of them was pretending the situations that had brought them here were anything other than what they were. He thought about Margaret while he sat there. He thought about her in the specific, almost involuntary way that grief worked. Not a summoning, but an arrival, the way a cold draft comes through a wall you thought was solid. He thought about how she would have made tea by now and found something to say that made the room feel larger than it was. She'd had that quality, the room-enlarging quality. Vivian did not have it. Vivian made the room feel exactly its actual size, which was its own kind of honesty. The arrangement continued. Through March, the weather gave them occasional windows of workable days between storms, and Caleb pushed the roof repair from temporary to permanent, replacing the compromised beam with timber he sourced from a mill on the south edge of the city. He'd negotiated the price down by offering a half-day's labor to the mill owner, who had a year's worth of unsplit wood sitting in his yard. He rebuilt the northeast window frame. He started on the floor near the back door. He also, with some reluctance that he couldn't entirely explain, began to tell Vivian things. Not everything, not in any confessional way, but small things. The particular quality of the timber he'd found, the way a certain section of the foundation showed evidence of old water damage that someone had repaired badly decades ago, the way Noah had laughed for the first time on a Tuesday morning when Caleb had been eating breakfast and made a face without intending to. Vivian received these pieces of information with the same even quality she brought to everything, without excessive response, but he noticed that she retained them. She asked about Noah's laugh the following week. Specifically, had he done it again, and what had been the trigger? She asked about the old water damage because she had wondered if there was a drainage problem on the west side of the cottage, and she wanted to know if the repair he'd found was consistent with her suspicion. She was interested. Not performed interest, but the real thing, which has a particular texture, a specificity, a follow-through, Questions that could only be asked by someone who remembered what they'd been told. He noticed it the way you notice a change in the weather before you can see it, by feel rather than evidence. The problems arrived in April. The first was social in nature, and he heard it from Prentice before he heard it anywhere else. The driver was a careful man who did not volunteer information, but he also seemed to believe that Caleb deserved to know certain things, so he delivered them in the plain-spoken way of someone who had decided information was a practical courtesy rather than gossip. "People are talking," Prentice said one morning while Caleb was loading timber scraps onto the wagon. "About Mrs. Ashford, about you being here." Caleb kept stacking. "What are they saying?" "That she's lost her judgment, that a woman of her position shouldn't be putting a destitute minor up on her property." Prentice paused. "Some worse things than that." "Worse like what?" Prentice looked at the middle distance. "Like maybe there's a reason she'd extend that kind of generosity to a young man in need." Caleb's hand stopped on the timber. He set the piece he was holding down with more care than it required. He thought about several responses and discarded all of them. Then he picked up the next piece of timber and stacked it. "Does she know?" he asked. "Mrs. Ashford knows what people say about her," Prentice said. "She always has." The second problem was more concrete. Graham Holloway came to the property on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of April, and Caleb knew who he was before Prentice told him because Holloway had the particular quality of a man who had spent several decades being the most important person in most rooms and had developed the corresponding assumption that rooms arranged themselves around his comfort. He was perhaps 60, with a good suit and a face that had once been handsome and was now impressive in the way of things that have aged into authority. He came with two men Caleb didn't recognize, which was information in itself. Caleb was on the roof of the cottage, doing final checks on the beamwork, when the carriage arrived. He stayed where he was. Holloway looked up at him without particular warmth. "You're Whitmore," he said. "I am." "Coming down from there." Caleb finished checking the joint he was on, which took another minute and a half, and then climbed down the ladder. Holloway watched this with the expression of someone who has decided to be patient as a form of condescension. "I'm going to be brief," Holloway said when Caleb was on the ground. "Vivian Ashford is a woman of considerable standing in this city. She is also, since her husband's death, a woman without the kind of counsel that might have prevented a situation like this one." He gestured at the cottage in a way that suggested the building was the problem rather than the building's condition. "Whatever arrangement she's offered you, I'd encourage you to reconsider it. There are people in Denver who would be troubled by a man of your background taking advantage of a widow's." "A man of my background," Caleb said. Holloway paused. "I wanted to make sure I understood the phrase correctly," Caleb said, before I responded to it. Holloway's two men shifted slightly. One of them had his arms crossed. "You were fired from the consolidated mine," Holloway said. "Your wife died in October. You were 3 months behind on your rent. You walked into Walter Briggs's store with what amounted to your last dollar and a damaged tin." He said all of this in the tone of a man reciting public record. "I'm not condemning your circumstances. I'm pointing out that a woman like Vivian Ashford is vulnerable to a certain kind of appeal that plays on—" "You've investigated me," Caleb said. "I've been thorough. Then you know I've been working this property for 6 weeks. You know the cottage roof has been repaired. You know the chimney has been cleaned and the floors are being replaced, and the drainage problem on the west side has been fixed." Caleb looked at him with a steadiness he didn't entirely feel. "If that's what taking advantage looks like, I'm not sure what you're protecting her from." Holloway's face did something complicated. "This isn't about the cottage." "Then say what it's actually about." The two men behind Holloway were very still. Holloway looked at Caleb for a long moment with the flat calculation of someone deciding how direct to be. "Vivian Ashford has a substantial estate," he said. "She has investments, properties, and social connections that represent real value in this city. She also has a history of making impulsive decisions following personal tragedy. Her late husband and I were close, and I made a promise to look after her interests when he was gone." He let that settle. "What I'm asking you to do is consider whether your presence here serves her interests or your own." "You could ask her the same question," Caleb said, "since she's the one who made the arrangement." "I'm asking you." "Because you think I'll be easier to move." Holloway didn't answer that, which was itself an answer. Caleb looked at the main house, visible through the cottonwood trees. "I appreciate you being direct," he said. "I'll be direct back." I'm a groundskeeper doing a job I was hired to do for wages I've earned on property that belongs to Mrs. Ashford. If she wants me to leave, she'll tell me. If she doesn't, I'll continue working." He looked back at Holloway. "I don't think you came here to negotiate. I think you came here to intimidate. Those are different things." Holloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're a stubborn man, Whitmore." "I've been told. That's not always a virtue. Neither is certainty about other people's lives." Holloway looked at him for another few seconds, then turned and walked back toward his carriage. His two men followed. At the carriage door, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "I'll be speaking with Vivian," he said. "That's between you and her," Caleb said. He watched the carriage go. His hands were not entirely steady. He noticed this with something between irritation and understanding, because he had learned that the body registered things differently than the mind did, and what the mind decided to be calm about did not always get communicated clearly to the hands. He climbed back up the ladder. He told Vivian about it that evening, not because he felt he owed her a report, but because not telling her felt like a deception, and he wasn't going to start that. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "Graham came to see me in January before I hired you." "About what?" "About the estate generally. He has a particular interest in a parcel of land on the eastern edge of this property. He's made 3 offers for it since my husband died." She turned her teacup slightly on the table. "I've declined 3 times. Caleb looked at her. "And now he's decided you're incompetent." "He's decided I need managing," she said, which is different in his understanding of things. He's not a cruel man. He's a man who has been the deciding voice in most situations for so long that the idea of someone simply not listening to him has become genuinely confusing. She set the cup down. "He'll apply pressure. He has before." "Through me?" "Now through you. Before it was through my lawyer, my banker, my late husband's associates." She said this without bitterness, just inventory. "The property line on the east parcel is complicated. There's a boundary dispute that's been in a drawer for 12 years. He'd like to see it resolved in his favor. He believes if he can establish that my decisions are erratic, that becomes easier." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "And is it erratic? Hiring me?" Vivian looked at him with that direct, flat quality. "It's unconventional," she said, "which is not the same thing." He nodded. "I'm not going to ask you to leave," she said, "if that's what you're wondering." "It wasn't. I was wondering if this would get worse before it got better." "Almost certainly," she said. "All right," he said, and that was the end of the conversation, though neither of them moved to leave immediately, and the stove continued to do its work, and outside the cottonwood trees stood in their gray arithmetic against the darkening sky. The social machinery of Denver began to move in the weeks that followed in the way social machinery does. Slowly, without clear origin, and with a momentum that doesn't require anyone to explicitly commit to anything. Caleb started hearing things at the mill, from Prentice, and the looks people gave him when he drove the wagon into town for supplies. 3 of Vivian's social acquaintances declined invitations to her spring dinner. A letter arrived from her banker asking for a meeting regarding estate management. The local paper ran a small item, not an article, just a mention in the society column, noting that Mrs. Vivian Ashford had undertaken renovations of her northern property with the assistance of a hired laborer previously employed at the consolidated mine, which managed to make something ordinary sound suspicious through the purity of its selective details. Vivian read the item and folded the paper and set it down and poured herself more coffee. "They called you a hired laborer," Caleb said. "You are a hired laborer." "The previously employed at the consolidated mine is doing some work in that sentence." "Yes," she said. "It is." She drank her coffee. "I've decided to do something that will make this worse before it makes it better." He waited. "I'm going to fund a school," she said, "for the children of mining families and frontier workers on the north side of the city. There's a need for it, and there's no institution providing for it." She looked at him. "Holloway and his associates will say it's impulsive, that I'm throwing money at causes because my judgment has been compromised." "Why are you telling me?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I want someone to know the actual reason," she said, "which is that I've been thinking about doing it for 2 years and I've simply been afraid of the noise it would make." She paused. "That's all." He looked at her across the table. In the corner behind her, Noah was asleep in the crib, one arm thrown back in that boneless, total sleep that infants manage, as if rest is something they know how to do completely without trying. Then do it, Caleb said. I intend to, she said. I wanted to say it out loud first. He nodded. Outside, the April wind came across the property in a long, cold gust that rattled the new window frame, the one he'd replaced, that now held solidly, and passed on. The school announcement came out the following week, and the noise it made was considerable, and Vivian absorbed it with the patience of someone who had made the decision with full knowledge of the noise and had built her internal walls accordingly. Caleb kept working. The East Parcel boundary dispute reappeared in the form of a formal legal letter to Vivian's lawyer. Holloway was moving his pieces on the board, methodically. There was a meeting that Vivian attended without telling Caleb about beforehand and mentioned only afterward, with the briefest of summaries. She'd been advised to settle, she'd declined, the matter would continue. You should have a better lawyer, Caleb said. I have a perfectly good lawyer, she said. He gave me correct advice. I simply didn't take it. Because you're right about the boundary. Because I'm right about the boundary, she confirmed. And then, on an evening in the last week of April, when the light was staying later and the air had the particular uncertain quality of a season that hadn't quite committed to itself, Noah pulled himself up by the edge of his crib and stood for approximately 4 seconds, wobbling and concentrated and completely unsupported, before sitting back down hard on his padded bottom with an expression of surprised dignity. Caleb saw it happen and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, quietly and to nobody in particular, Margaret, you would have loved this. It came out without planning, the way those things did. He sat there with it for a moment, then looked over at the east-facing window where the late light came through, and thought about how strange it was that hard things and good things arrived in the same season, sometimes in the same week, sometimes on the same afternoon, requiring you to hold both of them at once without letting either cancel the other out. He was still sitting there when he heard Vivian's footsteps on the path outside and her knock at the cottage door, 2 light raps the way she always knocked, and he got up to answer it. She was holding a folded letter. He could see that much before he'd even gotten the door fully open. The way she was carrying it, not in her basket, not tucked under her arm, the way she usually carried correspondence, but held in both hands in front of her, which was not a posture he'd seen from her before. Vivian Ashford did not hold things like they troubled her. She held things like she'd already decided what to do about them. This was different. Come in, he said, and stepped back. She came in. She looked at Noah in the crib. The boy had pulled himself back up to standing again and was holding the rail with both hands, enormously pleased with himself. And the line of her shoulders shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. Then she set the letter on the table. Holloway's lawyer sent this today, she said. To my lawyer, with a copy to me directly, which is a courtesy I didn't ask for and don't particularly appreciate. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down. He didn't reach for the letter. What does it say? It says that given my recent financial commitments, she said the phrase with a flatness that suggested she was quoting verbatim, specifically the school fund, and given what they characterize as an irregular domestic arrangement on my northern property, a group of concerned associates of my late husband's estate have begun an informal inquiry into the management of my affairs. She sat down across from him. Informal is the word doing the most work in that sentence. It means they haven't filed anything yet. It means they're giving me a window to adjust my behavior before they do. And adjusting behavior means what, specifically? It means closing the school fund. It means ending your employment here. She looked at him directly. It means demonstrating to their satisfaction that I'm capable of making appropriate decisions. Caleb was quiet for a moment. From the crib, Noah made a sound of concentrated effort. He was trying to get one leg up over the rail, which was not going to work in his favor, but he hadn't learned that yet. What are you going to do? Caleb asked. I've already done it, she said. I wrote back this afternoon. I told them that I found the inquiry premature, the characterization of my arrangements inaccurate, and the implied threat transparent. She paused. I also told them that if they'd like to examine my financial decisions, they are welcome to compare the current state of the North Cottage to its state 6 months ago and explain to me what irregular looks like when it results in a structurally sound building. Caleb almost smiled. Your lawyer approved that response? My lawyer read it after I sent it, she said. He has views. I imagine he does. He thinks I should have been more conciliatory. She looked at the letter on the table. He's probably right about the strategy. He's wrong about the principle. She reached out and turned the letter face down, a gesture that seemed less about hiding it and more about refusing to let it sit there and stare at her. I'm not going to be managed. I watched my husband be managed for the last 6 years of his life by men who believed that owning money entitled them to own the decisions of the people around it. And I watched it make him smaller year by year until the man I married was mostly in agreement with someone else's expectations. She said this without theatrical grief. It came out as fact, the way things do when they've been understood for a long time. I'm not interested in that. Caleb looked at her across the table. He thought about what she'd said once, in the early weeks. I learned to be alone, and I got good at it. And he understood now that what she'd gotten good at was not solitude, but sovereignty. The two had gotten confused, maybe even by her, but they weren't the same thing. All right, he said. All right, she said, and picked up her gloves from where she'd set them on the chair arm. Noah, at that moment, achieved the catastrophic success of getting his leg over the crib rail. He tipped forward, face first, with an expression that had only just begun to convert from triumph to alarm, and Caleb was across the room before the boy hit the floor, catching him at the last possible second with both hands, and swinging him up into the air in a motion so quick it startled even him. Noah laughed, the full, shameless, 4 seconds long laugh of an infant who has just had the exciting experience of nearly falling and found that being caught was apparently the funniest thing that had happened all week. Caleb stood there holding his laughing son and breathed. Vivian had risen from her chair at the sound but stopped when she saw that it was handled. She stood near the table with her gloves in her hand and watched Noah's face. And what was on her own face was not the careful assessment she usually carried. It was something simpler, something that didn't have a management strategy. She left a few minutes later. At the door she said, I'll speak to my lawyer tomorrow about the boundary survey. It's time to stop letting that sit in a drawer. That's going to make Holloway move faster, Caleb said. Probably, she said. But waiting hasn't made him move slower. She pulled on her gloves. Good night, Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his given name without the slight formality she usually maintained. He wasn't sure she'd noticed. He didn't point it out. Good night, he said. The next 6 weeks taught him what pressure actually looked like when it was applied by someone who knew how to use it. Holloway did not come back to the property. He didn't need to. What he did instead was quieter and more effective. He worked the city's architecture of influence with the patience of a man who had been building that architecture for 30 years. Alone. Vivian had been negotiating for the school's construction, suddenly stalled at the bank. Her regular supplier of building materials sent a letter saying his prices had been revised upward due to market conditions. 2 of the 3 contractors she'd spoken to about the school building declined to bid, without specific explanation. Caleb learned most of this not from Vivian but from Prentice, who had a network of information that operated through the city's drivers, stable hands, and delivery men. People who were in rooms when things were decided and were assumed by the people deciding things to be furniture. The bank manager had lunch with Holloway on Tuesday, Prentice said, one morning in late May. Came back and found reasons the school loan needed additional review. What reasons? The kind that don't have specific names, Prentice said. Procedural. Timing. The special language bankers use when they want to say no without saying no. Caleb turned that over while he worked. He was laying new stone along the west drainage channel. The problem Vivian had suspected was real, and fixing it properly required digging down and relaying the stone in a way that directed water away from the foundation. It was slow, physical work, which suited his mind's tendency to work through problems in parallel with his hands. He'd been thinking about the East Parcel boundary dispute since Vivian had mentioned it. He'd been thinking about it with the particular attention of someone who didn't fully understand the situation yet, but had learned enough about how a foundation worked, any foundation, stone or legal, to know that you didn't fix a boundary problem by arguing about the boundary. You fixed it by finding out exactly where it was, from the original source. That evening he asked Vivian if he could see the original land deed. She looked at him. Why? I want to understand what Holloway is actually disputing, he said, not what his lawyers say. The actual document. She brought it the next day. It was an original deed from 1861, filed with the Colorado Territory Land Office, handwritten in the careful script of a recorder who'd taken the job seriously. The property lines were described by reference to a series of physical markers, a particular boulder, a tree line, a creek bend, some of which had been there in 1861, and some of which might or might not still be there. Caleb spent 3 evenings with the deed, a pencil, and a piece of paper, working out what the described boundaries would translate to in current measurements. He was not a surveyor. He had no formal training in land law, but he had spent years working in tunnels and shafts where measurement was the difference between a wall that held and a wall that killed you, and he understood geometry with a practical, physical confidence that had nothing to do with education. What he found was this: the disputed east parcel, according to the original deed, was not adjacent to the boundary Holloway's survey claimed. There was a difference of approximately 40 yards, which was not a clerical error. 40 yards in that direction would shift the value of the parcel considerably because it included a section of the creek frontage that Holloway wanted for a mill he was planning. He brought his working to Vivian. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You're saying the original markers would put the boundary here," she said, pointing at his pencil line. "If the creek bend and the boulder tree the deed describes are still locatable," he said. "I think they are. The creek in that area doesn't move much, and there's an old tree on the east edge of the property that I think matches the description." Vivian looked at the paper. "This would mean Holloway's survey is wrong by 40 yards. Or it's right, and someone told the surveyor to read the deed differently than it reads," Caleb said. "Those are the only 2 options." She was quiet for a moment. "My husband hired that surveyor," she said, "in 1882. "I know. Holloway was close with my husband in 1882. "I know," Caleb said again. She sat back from the paper. On the table between them, the working sat with its pencil lines and notations, rough, imperfect, the product of 3 evenings of effort by a man with no legal credentials, and represented something that was either very important or completely irrelevant depending on whether the original markers were findable. "I need to walk the east boundary," Vivian said. "Tomorrow. I'll come with you." They went the next morning early before the day's heat made the going unpleasant. Caleb brought the deed and his working, and Vivian brought a compass and the quiet, focused quality she brought to problems she'd decided to solve. The creek bend was where Caleb had estimated it would be, based on the deed's description and his rough measurement from the north corner of the property. The boulder tree was there too, an ancient cottonwood that had grown thick and strange. Its base split into 3 trunks now, but with the distinctive forking at the original trunk that the deed's recorder had described as a landmark. They stood beside it in the May morning, and Vivian looked at where the tree stood relative to where Holloway's survey placed the boundary line. 38 yards, she said, after she'd paced it out. "I had 40, Caleb said. "We can argue about 2 yards later." She was looking at the creek frontage. From where they stood, you could see the section of creek that a mill would need, the flat bank, the water moving at a useful pace through the bend. "He wants the mill," she said. "He's been planning it for years. He needs the creek frontage, and he needs the slope for the wheel, and both of those are on the correct side of the boundary, not the side his survey claims." "What does your lawyer need to challenge it?" "An independent survey? Documented reference to the original markers." She looked at the tree. "And time. Legal processes take time." "Which is what he's been using against you," Caleb said. "Waiting is his strategy because waiting costs you money and stress, and he has more of both." "Yes." She turned from the tree. "I need a surveyor who isn't connected to anyone in Holloway's circle, which in Denver is harder than it sounds." She started walking back toward the main property. "I know a man in Pueblo who I believe is honest. He'd need to travel, which adds cost." "Do it," Caleb said. She glanced back at him. "You're very decisive about my money." "You're decisive about your money when you know what you're deciding. You've been waiting because you didn't have enough information." He kept pace with her. "Now you have more." She walked for a moment. "It's not conclusive. We found a tree in a creek bend. His lawyers will argue the deed's descriptions are too vague, that the markers could have shifted, that—" "His lawyers will argue whatever he tells them to argue," Caleb said. "That's different from whether you're right." Vivian stopped walking. She turned and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen before on her face. Not the assessment, not the careful inventory, but something less managed, slightly raw at the edges. "My husband used to say something similar," she said. That I conflated the difficulty of the argument with the wrongness of the position. She paused. I hated when he said it because he was usually right. Was he often right? Often enough that I'm still listening to him 6 years after his death, she said, and turned and kept walking. The surveyor from Pueblo arrived in the second week of June. His name was Ira Bent, and he was a compact, sun-worn man in his 60s who had the manner of someone who had spent his career being the person two sides called an honest broker and had made peace with the loneliness that entailed. He walked the east boundary for 2 full days with his instruments, referring to the deed and the original markers Caleb had identified. And on the evening of the second day, he sat down with Vivian and her lawyer and presented his findings. The boundary, according to his survey, was 37 yards east of where Holloway's 1882 survey had placed it. The original markers were consistent with the deed's descriptions. In his professional opinion, the 1882 survey had misidentified the boulder tree, which had been attributed to a different, smaller cottonwood that had since died, rather than the larger forked tree that matched the deed's description of its size and form. Vivian's lawyer, a thin, careful man named Aldrich, who had been skeptical of the whole enterprise from the start, read through Bent's findings twice and then said, "This changes the picture considerably." "Yes," Vivian said, "Holloway will contest it. I expect he will. This could go on for another 2 years in the courts." "It won't," Vivian said. "I'm going to make it public before it goes to court. The original deed, the original markers, Bent's survey, the discrepancy between the 1882 survey and the actual boundary. I'm going to put it in front of the Denver Land Recorder's office and the newspaper simultaneously, so that whatever Holloway's response is, it will have to be a public one." Aldrich looked at her for a moment. "That's aggressive." "It's accurate," she said. "Those are different things." He nodded slowly. "He'll come back hard." "I'm aware." Caleb was not in that meeting. He'd been keeping Noah occupied in the kitchen of the main house while Vivian and her lawyer spoke in the study. But she told him about it afterward, standing in the hallway with the door to the kitchen open and Noah visible on the floor behind her, systematically removing the contents of a low kitchen cabinet with the focused intensity of someone doing important work. "He's going to come hard," Caleb said when she finished. "Yes. You're ready for that." "I'm readier for that than for continuing to wait," she said. "Waiting is losing slowly. This at least has a direction." He looked at her. The late afternoon light came through the hallway window and caught the gray at her temples, and she looked tired in the particular way of someone who has been fighting a long battle with good discipline. Not beaten, but aware of the cost. He thought about what it must have taken, across the years since her husband died, to keep this property and this life intact against the steady pressure of men who believed they knew better. She'd done it alone, which was not the same as doing it easily. Behind her, Noah had successfully removed a large pot from the cabinet and was examining it with the expression of someone who has found treasure. "You found the boundary tree," Caleb said. "You found it," she said. "I walked to it." "We walked to it." She looked at him for a moment longer than the conversation required. "Yes," she said, "we did." The public filing happened on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Holloway knew. By Friday afternoon, Caleb knew that Holloway knew, because Prentice came back from a supply run into the city with the particular careful expression he wore when he was delivering news he'd decided needed to be delivered. "There are men in town saying things," Prentice said. "What kind of things?" "The kind that aren't about the boundary anymore." Prentice set down the supplies he'd brought and looked at Caleb directly. "They're saying Whitmore found that survey information because he's been working the widow for her property. That he got himself set up on her land and talked her into a legal fight that would drain her resources." He paused. "They're saying it's a con. That you came out of that mine broke and found a mark." Caleb heard that word, mark, and felt it land in a specific place, the same place the word charity had landed months ago in Briggs's store. The place where a true thing and a false thing look identical from the outside. "Who's saying this?" he said. "People who are friends of people who are friends of Holloway's," Prentice said, "which in this city is a considerable number." Caleb thought about what to do with this information for about 3 minutes. Then he went and found Vivian. She was in the north garden, which had gone from a wasteland of dead plants to something that, under her intermittent attention across the spring, had produced a row of actual green things with the surprised vigor of growth that hadn't been expected to happen. She was looking at a young tomato vine when Caleb came through the gate and told her what Prentice had said. She listened without changing her expression. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the vine. "They're calling you a con man," she said. "Yes." "And by implication calling me a fool who couldn't see it." "Yes." She looked up from the vine. "And what do you want me to do with this?" "Nothing," he said. "I wanted you to know." She looked at him. "Did you think I might believe it?" He hadn't entirely thought about what he'd been afraid she'd think. He'd just come directly to her, which had felt like the only thing to do. But sitting in the silence of her question, he realized that yes, at some level, he'd been afraid that the story, the con man story, the calculate widow story, might lodge somewhere inside her reasoning, might make her look at the whole arrangement with new suspicion. Not because she was weak, but because the story was constructed just carefully enough to fit the surface of the facts. "I didn't know," he said honestly. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to the garden. "I know who you are," she said. "I watched you count out your last coins and then count them out again. I watched you carry your son in February cold. I watched you repair a beam over your own head in weather that would have sent most men inside." She pulled a small weed motion. "Graham Holloway has a great deal of resources and no understanding at all of what it means to need something real." She dropped the weed. "He can say what he likes." Caleb breathed. Something in him had been braced without his quite knowing it, and the release of it was physical. A slight easing across his shoulders, the breath going properly into his lungs. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and went back to the garden. It was 3 days later that the real blow came, and it came from a direction neither of them had been watching. Caleb woke at 4 in the morning to a sound he couldn't immediately identify, a low, irregular percussion that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, and then he placed it, hail. He was out of bed and at the window in the same motion, and what he saw in the darkness outside was not hail but sleet, heavy, wet, almost freezing, coming sideways on a wind that had arrived without warning and was now making itself thoroughly at home. He checked Noah first. The boy was sleeping through it, his breath even and deep, one arm thrown out toward the edge of the crib in that fearless sleeping posture. The cottage was holding. The roof, his roof, the one he'd spent 2 weeks repairing properly, was doing what it was supposed to do. He put on his coat and went outside. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees from the previous afternoon. The sky to the northwest had the bruised, absolute dark of a storm that had been building for days and had finally committed. The sleet was already lying on the ground, not deep, but thin and vicious, and the wind was the kind that found every gap in your clothing and located the specific places on your skin that were most vulnerable. He checked the drainage channel he'd relayed on the west side. It was working. The water was moving through it properly, away from the foundation. He checked the roof joints and the chimney cap and the window frames, all of which were holding. He was coming back around the north side of the cottage when he heard the sound from the timber stand, a long, low crack, then a second one, then a sustained groaning that he recognized as a tree under more stress than it was designed for. He stopped. He stood in the sleet with the wind hitting him from the northwest and listened, and what he heard in the pauses between the wind was the timber stand moving in a way it shouldn't have been moving. He'd thinned it properly in February and March, clearing the dead wood, but there were 3 large cottonwoods on the northern edge that he'd planned to address in summer. They were old trees, their root systems shallow after years of the creek shifting, and he'd noted them as a future project in the practical way you noted projects when the immediate problem was the roof and the floor and the drainage. He went toward the sound. He got 30 yards into the timber stand when the first tree went. It went slowly, with the dignity that disasters sometimes had, a long lean, a pause, and then a controlled descent that became uncontrolled at the last moment when the root system finally gave. It came down across the north path, well short of the cottage, and the sound of it hitting the ground came up through the frozen earth and into Caleb's feet. He stood there in the dark and the sleet and counted the remaining old cottonwoods. 3. 2 had been on the north edge. 1 was further in, closer to the cottage. He turned and ran. He got back to the cottage door and went inside and picked up Noah, blankets and all, not waking him, and wrapped him in his own coat and carried him at a fast walk through the sleet toward the main house. The ground was treacherous. the thin sleet having turned the path to something between mud and ice, and he fell once, managing to turn as he went down and take the impact on his shoulder rather than the baby, and came up with his knee bleeding through his trousers and kept moving. The main house was locked. He went to the back door, which he knew had a tendency to stick rather than lock properly, and shouldered it open without ceremony. The noise woke Prentice first, and Prentice woke Vivian, and by the time Caleb had Noah settled on the kitchen floor on a blanket, the boy had slept through the entire event and was now apparently willing to sleep on the kitchen floor as well, having apparently decided that Caleb's judgment on sleeping locations was acceptable. Vivian was in the doorway in her dressing gown with a lamp, looking at the mud on Caleb's coat and the blood on his trouser leg with that rapid, assessing calm. "The timber stand," he said. "One of the old cottonwoods came down across the north path. There are 2 more that are compromised. The third one—" He stopped. He had not heard the third tree. He looked at Vivian. "The third tree is close to the cottage," she said. "Yes." They looked at each other. "Stay here," he said. "Caleb, stay with Noah," he said. "Please." He went back out into the sleet. The path back to the cottage was worse than it had been 5 minutes ago. The temperature was still dropping, and the sleet was thickening into something that couldn't decide if it was ice or snow and had settled on being both. He could see the cottage from the tree line, the lamp he'd left burning in the main room making a yellow rectangle in the window. He got to the north wall and looked up. The third cottonwood had not fallen. It was leaning, not dramatically, not yet at the angle of collapse, but with a lean that had not been there when he'd assessed it in March. He could hear the root system working against the frozen ground, a sound like something very old and very large breathing. He needed to know which way it would fall. He walked around it, staying well clear, reading the lean, reading the wind direction, reading the root damage he could see on the east side where the shallow roots had pulled away from the soil. If it went east, it would miss the cottage. If it went west, it would take the north wall directly. The wind shifted. He watched the trees lean respond to it, the crown swinging slightly in the new direction, and he understood with the particular clarity of physical instinct that the tree was going to go west. He had perhaps 20 minutes, maybe fewer. He went into the cottage and got the tools he needed, a saw, the heavy-headed maul, 2 wedges, and began working on the east side of the base, cutting and driving wedges in the pattern he'd learned in the mines for directing a fall. His hands were numb within 5 minutes, and the saw kept catching on the frozen wood, and the wind made it impossible to hear what the tree was telling him through vibration, which was normally the primary way he read a situation like this. He cut and drove, losing track of time, losing feeling in his fingers, and then Vivian was beside him, not in her dressing gown but in her coat and boots, with a lamp held high against the wind, giving him light he hadn't known he needed until it was there. "I told you to stay," he said. "You needed light," she said. "Prentice is with Noah." He looked at her. The sleet was coming down on the lamp, making it gutter, and she had her other arm raised to shield it. Her hair was coming down from its pins, and the sleet was in it, and her expression was completely practical. He went back to work. The wedge driving was 2-person work when you were doing it in conditions like this, and they both knew it without discussing it. She held the lamp, he drove the wedges, and when the tree gave its final warning sound, a deep concussive crack from somewhere in its core, she said, "Now," with absolute steadiness, and they both moved east, clear of the fall line, and the tree went west exactly as he'd read it, missing the north wall of the cottage by 11 feet. The sound it made hitting the frozen ground was enormous. It seemed to go through the earth and come up through their feet and into their bones. They stood in the sleet for a moment. 11 feet, Caleb said. "I counted 12, Vivian said. He looked at her. She was holding the lamp and her hair was completely down now, and she was soaked to the bone, and she was watching the fallen tree with the expression of someone who has just done a difficult thing and is still processing whether it worked. "You're going to be sick," he said. "Possibly," she said. "That was going to take the wall." "Yes." "If Noah had been in there, He wasn't," Caleb said. She turned and looked at him. Up close, in the lamp's light, her eyes were very dark and her face was wet and the composure was not there. Not entirely. There was something underneath it that was raw and unhidden, the particular face of a person who has just been physically afraid and is still coming back from the edge of it. "No," she said. "He wasn't." They stood there in the falling sleet with the lamp between them, and neither of them moved for a moment that was longer than the cold strictly allowed. Then she turned toward the main house. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you." He followed her through the dark and the freezing night, back toward the lighted windows of the house where Prentice was keeping watch, and Noah was sleeping on the kitchen floor, with the peaceful certainty of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of the world and trusted entirely that the people around him would keep it from landing on him, which, so far, they had. He did get sick. Not Vivian. She was apparently constructed from materials more resistant to June sleet than ordinary people, and came through the night without so much as a cough, which Caleb found faintly unreasonable given that she'd been standing in freezing rain holding a lamp over a falling tree for the better part of an hour. What she got instead was a cold that lasted exactly 2 days, and then departed as if it had somewhere more important to be, which also seemed characteristic. Caleb got a fever that arrived the following evening and stayed for 4 days. He was not a good sick person. He knew this about himself without pleasure. He had the particular male stubbornness about illness that came from years of working environments where stopping was not an option, and which had calcified into an inability to stop even when stopping was clearly the correct and obvious response to a body that was telling him in very plain language that it had reached its limit. He kept getting up. Prentice kept making him sit back down. Noah, who had been installed in the main house for the duration of the fever, seemed to find the whole situation interesting and spent considerable time standing at the kitchen doorway, looking toward wherever Caleb was with the expression of someone monitoring a situation. Vivian managed the household with the same even efficiency she brought to managing the property, without ceremony, without fuss, without making anyone feel they were being managed. She arranged for Prentice to check the cottage twice daily for further tree damage. She sent Aldrich a note about the storm's impact on the north boundary and its potential relevance to the survey timeline. She kept Noah fed and occupied, which was a more considerable task than it sounded because the boy was now mobile in a horizontal sense, not quite walking but managing a rapid and determined crawl that covered ground with alarming speed and had no concept of obstacles as anything other than opportunities. On the 3rd day of the fever, Caleb woke up in the small room off the main house kitchen where they'd put him and found Vivian sitting in the chair beside the window reading a letter. The morning light was coming through the curtain in long, pale strips, and Noah was asleep on a folded blanket in the corner, which meant it was early. The boy was an early riser, and once he was up, the house knew it. "You're reading my correspondence," Caleb said. She looked up. "It's mine," she said. "I come here in the early morning because it's quiet. You happen to be in the room." He looked at the ceiling. His head felt slightly detached from the rest of him, the particular floating quality of a fever that was breaking rather than building. "What time is it?" 5:30. "Noah's still sleeping." "Yes." She glanced at the boy in the corner. "He had a difficult night. Teeth, I think. He settled around 4. Caleb turned his head to look at her. She was in her day dress already, which meant she'd been up for a while, and the letter in her hands was the same quality of paper she used for legal correspondence. She had the reading posture she always had, straight, a slight forward lean, like a woman who had been told to sit up straight so early in her life that it had become a default rather than an effort. "You were up with him," he said, "at 4 in the morning." "Prentice was up with him at 4 in the morning," she said. "I joined at 4:15 because I could hear it from my room, and Prentice was clearly running out of solutions." "What solutions did you try?" "I walked him," she said without looking up from the letter. "Around the kitchen. 13 circuits, approximately, before he went down." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He thought about her walking the kitchen at 4:15 in the morning with his son, counting circuits. "Vivian," he said. She looked up. He didn't know exactly what he'd been going to say. The words had arrived at the surface without specific content behind them, or rather with too much content, imprecise and unmanageable. He lay there with the fever-light feeling in his head, and the morning coming through the curtains, and Noah breathing in the corner, and he said, "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment with that quality she had, the direct, undecorated attention, and then she looked back at her letter. "You would have done the same," she said. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do," she said, and the conversation ended there, not because there was nothing more to say, but because what remained between the lines of it was something neither of them was quite prepared to name out loud in the early morning light, with the fever still in the room. He was on his feet by the fifth day, which was faster than was probably wise, but consistent with who he was. And by the end of the week, he was back at the cottage assessing the damage from the storm with the particular focus of someone who needed physical work to clear his head. The fallen cottonwood had not touched the cottage wall, but the root system coming up had disturbed the ground on the north side in a way that would affect drainage if not addressed. 2 sections of the fence that ran along the north path were down. The timber stand itself needed proper assessment now. He'd been planning to do it in summer, and summer had apparently decided to arrive without waiting for him to feel better. The storm had done something else as well, something he hadn't anticipated. It had shifted the feel of the property. He noticed it without being able to say exactly what had changed. It was something about the way Vivian moved through the main house, the way Prentice had taken to stopping at the cottage in the evenings to talk about the next day's work, the way Noah, installed now in the small room off the kitchen in the main house, had apparently decided that this was where he lived and demonstrated this conviction by crawling to the kitchen doorway every morning and looking expectantly at whoever was first in the kitchen as if to say, "Well, here I am. What are we doing today?" The storm had pressed them together in a way that ordinary life hadn't managed, and the pressing had left them closer than they'd been, in the specific way that shared physical fear does. Not through sentiment, but through the body's memory of standing in the dark beside another person when something was falling. Caleb thought about this while he was working on the fence, not because he was the type to think much about the architecture of relationships, but because the thinking arrived without invitation in the way that things did when your hands were occupied and your mind was free. He thought about Margaret. He thought about her in a different way than he usually did. Not the grief way, not that involuntary arrival at the wall he'd built around October and everything in it, but a more deliberate consideration. He thought about what she would have made of all this. The cottage, the work, Vivian. He thought she would have had something sharp and precise to say about Vivian, the way she always had sharp, precise things to say about people she'd observed carefully, and he thought she would have said it without cruelty, but with the accuracy that had been one of the things he loved about her. I thought that she would have liked Vivian, and that this was a strange and complicated thing to think, and that thinking it felt less like betrayal and more like the natural movement of time, which did not ask your permission before it moved. He did not do anything with these thoughts. He finished the fence section he was on and moved to the next one. The land survey results became public the second week of July, when Vivian's lawyer Aldrich filed them simultaneously with the Denver Land Recorder's Office and provided a copy to the Rocky Mountain News. The newspaper ran a brief item on it, brief but specific, which was what mattered, noting that an independent survey had found a significant discrepancy between the 1882 boundary assessment of the Ashford North parcel and the original 1861 territorial deed, and that the matter had been formally submitted for review. Holloway's response came within 48 hours, and it was not subtle. He filed a counterclaim with the Land Recorder's Office, disputing the validity of Ira Bent's survey on grounds that the original markers were not reliably identifiable after 30 years, and that the 1882 survey had been conducted by a licensed professional operating in good faith. He also, simultaneously, accelerated his informal campaign against Vivian in the city's social and business circles to a level that moved it from background pressure to something more visible. The school construction loan was formally declined by the bank. 3 of Vivian's other investments, small ones, but real, received letters from their respective managers indicating that various complications had arisen. And a meeting of Denver's Civic Improvement Committee, of which Vivian had been a member for 6 years, was scheduled for a time she'd specifically told the chairman she was unavailable, effectively excluding her from a vote on the North District Development Plan that directly affected the land near the school site. Caleb learned about most of this in pieces, from Vivian, from Prentice, from Aldrich, who had taken to stopping at the property on his way home from the office with the drained expression of a man fighting on too many fronts simultaneously. "He's not trying to win the boundary dispute anymore," Caleb said, one evening when Vivian had laid out the week's developments on the kitchen table with the systematic exhaustion of someone cataloging damage. "He's trying to make winning it cost you more than it's worth." "Yes," she said. "How long can you sustain the legal costs?" She looked at him. It was a direct question about money, which was not something they discussed explicitly, and he understood from her brief pause that she was deciding how directly to answer. 18 months, she said, perhaps 20 if I'm careful. After that, I'd be drawing on principal rather than income. And the school? The school is funded separately from a portion of a bond that matured last spring. Holloway can't touch that without winning the boundary case first, and winning the boundary case would give him the creek frontage he wants, but not the school parcel, which is on the east side of the original boundary, regardless of which survey is correct. She looked at her papers. He knows this, which is why he's working the bank and the committee instead of just the court. He's trying to exhaust you. That's always been his method. She gathered the papers into a stack with one decisive motion. What I can't determine is whether he actually believes I'll give up, or whether he's simply the type who applies maximum pressure regardless of whether it's working, because that's what he's always done. Does it matter which? She thought about it. No, she said. The response is the same either way. Caleb looked at her. She was tired. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the particular way the tiredness was managed rather than hidden, distributed through her posture like weight carried correctly. She'd been running at this pace since February without significant rest, and the summer heat was adding its own tax on top of everything else. The civic committee meeting, he said. The one they scheduled when you're unavailable. Thursday at 2. Are you actually unavailable, or did you tell him you were unavailable for a different reason? She looked at him. I told Chairman Burrell I had a prior engagement. Do you? I told him I did, she said carefully. Vivian. She picked up her tea. I didn't want to attend a 4-hour meeting about drainage infrastructure on the North District when I had 3 legal responses to draft. But now you do. She looked at the middle distance. He could see her doing the arithmetic, the cost of the 4-hour meeting versus the cost of being excluded from the vote, the drainage infrastructure on the North District, and how it related to the school site, the particular signal that her absence would send to Holloway's people on the committee. The drainage plan would affect the school's access road, she said slowly. I don't know anything about drainage infrastructure planning, Caleb said, but I know that if someone scheduled a meeting about the tunnel supports when I happened to be off shift, and I found out the supports were going to be built wrong, I would have gone in on my day off. She looked at him for a moment. I'll tell Burrell I've resolved my prior engagement, she said. Good. She went to the committee meeting on Thursday and sat through 4 hours of drainage infrastructure discussion and voted against the proposed North District plan on 3 specific amendments that would, as she explained to Caleb that evening, with the compressed efficiency of someone who has processed a lot of information and is delivering only the relevant parts, have routed the primary drainage channel in a way that would have required the school's access road to be relocated at considerable expense. She won 2 of the 3 votes. The third one passed by a single vote, and she came home with the expression of someone who has absorbed a setback and is deciding what to do with it rather than sitting in it. 2 out of 3, Caleb said. The third one is fixable, she said. The road can be rerouted a different way if the eastern culvert is extended. It costs more, but it's possible. She sat down. Holloway's man on the committee, a fellow named Marsh, voted against me on all 3. I expected that. What I didn't expect was Hendricks. Who's Hendricks? He's been on the committee for 12 years. He and my husband were friendly. He voted with Holloway's people on 2 of the 3 amendments. She set her gloves on the table. That means Holloway has gotten to people I thought were neutral. Or they were never neutral. Or they were never neutral, she agreed, which is a different problem. Caleb thought about the problem while he was working the following week. The fence was done, the north drainage was done, and he was now working on clearing and properly replanting the kitchen garden that had been untended for years and had reverted to a state of aggressive independence. The work was quieter than structural work, more patient, which gave his mind more room. He thought about what Holloway was actually doing, underneath the boundary dispute and the loan and the committee. He thought about it with the same instinct he'd used on the boundary tree, reading the direction of fall, understanding the root system, working out not what was visible but what the visible things were attached to. What Holloway wanted was the creek frontage for his mill. That had been clear from the beginning. The mill was a real commercial venture. Prentice had gotten information through his network about Holloway's plans, and it was a proper industrial mill that would serve the mining operations east of the city, which were growing. The creek frontage on Vivian's east parcel was the best site for it within reasonable distance of the mines. Holloway had been trying to get it for years. The boundary dispute, if it went to court, would take 2 to 3 years and cost both sides substantially. Holloway could afford it longer than Vivian could, which was presumably his calculation. If he could simultaneously exhaust her financially through the dispute while isolating her socially through the committee and the bank, he might eventually create a situation where settling, which meant surrendering the east parcel at his price, was her least bad option. But there was something Caleb had been turning over for a few weeks that he hadn't yet said out loud, because he wasn't sure enough of it. He brought it to Vivian on a Saturday afternoon when she was in the north garden and Noah was asleep inside, and the heat of the Colorado summer was lying over everything in a flat, pressing way that made the shade of the cottonwood trees feel like a gift. "What if the boundary dispute isn't actually about the boundary?" he said. She looked up from the plant she was tying to its stake. "Say that again." "The mill," he said. "Holloway needs the creek frontage. But the creek frontage is only valuable for the mill if he can also get water rights to the creek for the wheel. Water rights in Colorado are recorded separately from land." She was very still. "If you already hold a water right on that creek section," he said, "the land without the water right is worth considerably less. He can have the frontage and still not be able to build his mill if the water right is held against him." Vivian let go of the plant stake. "My husband filed a water right on the North Creek section in 1879, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "For irrigation. We irrigated the East Field for 3 years, and then the field project was abandoned and the right was never used. It's been sitting in a filing drawer with my husband's papers." She paused. "I had forgotten about it entirely." Caleb looked at her. "Does Holloway know about it?" he said. "He would have known at the time it was filed," she said. "It's public record. Whether he's thought about it recently—" She stopped. "If he's forgotten it, the entire strategy of the boundary dispute changes. He'd be buying land that couldn't support his mill without coming back to me for the water right anyway. Which means he'd have to buy the land and then negotiate the water right separately. Which means the land without the water right is worth half what he's been acting like it's worth." She stood up from the garden bed, not with her usual controlled rise, but with the quick movement of someone who has just seen something that changes the picture. "I need to find that document." She found it that evening. It was exactly where she'd described, in a flat leather portfolio in the bottom drawer of her late husband's desk, which she had not opened in 3 years because the desk had been his in a specific private way that she hadn't been ready to go through. She sat at the desk for a moment before she opened the drawer, and Caleb, who was in the doorway, saw her do it and looked at the wall and gave her the moment without comment. The water right document was there, filed September 14, 1879, with the Colorado Territory Water Commissioner's Office. It specified the volume, the usage purpose, and the specific creek section, which was, as Caleb had estimated, the precise section that Holloway's mill would require. She set the document on the desk and looked at it. "He doesn't know," she said, "or he's forgotten, because if he knew, he would have moved to acquire this first, before anything else." She looked at Caleb. "He's been fighting the wrong battle." "So have you, in a way," Caleb said. "Fighting about the boundary when the boundary matters less than this." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I need to decide whether to use this immediately or wait until the right moment. What does Aldrich think?" "I haven't told him yet. I'm telling you first." She looked at the document, then at him. "Because you found it. Because without you thinking about the mill and the water and what Holloway actually needed, this would have stayed in the drawer." Caleb looked at her in the lamplight of the study. The desk with its papers, the portrait of her late husband on the wall, the document between her hands that was about to change the shape of everything. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to wait," she said. "I want to let the survey dispute proceed to the point where Holloway has committed his resources fully, where he's paid his lawyers and called in his favors and made his noise about my competence and my judgment. And then I want to put this document in front of the land recorder's office and his lawyer simultaneously, and watch him understand that the land he's been fighting for isn't worth to him what he thought it was." Caleb nodded slowly. "That's cold," he said. "Is it wrong?" "No," he said. "It's right. It's exactly right. It's just cold." "He called you a con man," she said. "He called me incompetent and impulsive and implied I needed to be protected from my own decisions. He froze my school loan and manipulated the committee and sat in front of your face and told you to leave." She set the document down carefully. I find that I have limited warmth for him. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Right, he said. All right, she said, and put the document back in the portfolio with a careful, final motion that suggested she knew exactly where it was and intended to know exactly where it was for some time. August arrived with the particular intensity that summer saved for its final statement, the heat peaking and then breaking slightly in the last week, bringing evenings that were cool enough to sit outside after dark. Caleb had finished the kitchen garden rehabilitation and moved on to clearing and reseeding the south field, which had been nothing but weeds and volunteer grass for years, and which, with some attention, could become productive pasture by the following spring. Noah, at 11 months, had finally walked. He'd done it in the kitchen of the main house on a Tuesday morning, crossing the distance between the kitchen table and Caleb with the concentrated, barely controlled forward momentum of someone who has worked out the theory but not yet mastered the mechanics. He'd made it 4 steps and then sat down suddenly, hard, looking startled. Caleb had been on the floor beside him in an instant, and Noah had grabbed his father's face with both hands, the particular grip he used when he wanted to make sure he had full attention, and said something emphatic and entirely unintelligible. Vivian had seen it from the doorway. She was holding a coffee cup and she was laughing, and it was not the brief, controlled smile she sometimes showed, but a genuine laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that changes a person's face entirely and reveals who they might have been if less had happened to them. It lasted only a few seconds before she recovered her composure, but Caleb saw it, and he filed it away in the particular internal place where he kept things that mattered. Later, when Noah was down for his afternoon sleep and the house was quiet, Caleb found her in the garden and said, without preamble, "You should laugh more." She looked at him. "That's an odd thing to say to someone," she said. "It's an observation." "It's a suggestion disguised as an observation." "Maybe," he said. "It's still true." She looked at the garden. The tomato vine she'd been tending since spring had produced 3 actual tomatoes, which she had received with the particular satisfaction of someone who wasn't sure the thing was going to work and was not prepared to admit how much they'd been hoping it would. "I laughed when I had more to laugh at," she said. "Or more accurately, when I had people around who generated it. Noah generates it." "Noah generates it," she agreed. She looked at the vine. "So do you, occasionally, though I don't always tell you." He looked at her. She was looking at the vine, not at him, which was how she managed the things she said that she wasn't entirely sure she was going to say until they were out. "I make you laugh," he said. "Sometimes," she said, "when you're not trying to." He thought about that. "That's the best kind," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They stood in the garden for another minute, not saying anything, the late August light coming down through the leaves and shifting patches on the ground between them, and Noah's small voice audible from inside the house, the particular half-awake sound he made when he was considering whether to wake up fully or go back down. He went back down. The garden was quiet. The distance between them, which had been considerable in February when a gold coin landed on a store counter, and which had been decreasing in increments so small that neither of them had been tracking the measurement, was now something considerably narrower than either of them had named or was quite ready to name. In the late summer afternoon, with the tomato vine between them and the city at a distance and everything that was going to happen next still a few weeks away from arriving. But it was there, it was measurably, undeniably, quietly there. And both of them knew it. The water right document stayed in the leather portfolio for 6 more weeks. Vivian was patient about it in a way that Caleb found both admirable and occasionally maddening, because patience was something he understood in the context of physical work. Waiting for wood to dry, waiting for ground to settle, waiting for a structure to tell you what it needed. But the strategic patience she was exercising required a quality of stillness that didn't come naturally to him. He wanted to move. She was waiting for the right moment, the way a person waits for the right weather, with the full knowledge that forcing it accomplished nothing. Holloway kept moving his pieces. September brought 2 more legal filings, procedural ones, Aldrich explained, designed less to advance his position than to generate cost and delay on Vivian's side. The school construction, which had been proceeding on the strength of the bond money despite the bank loan denial, hit a problem with its timber supplier, who abruptly revised his delivery schedule in a way that pushed the frame raising back by 3 weeks. Prentice traced this through his network to a conversation between the supplier and a business associate of Holloway's which was the kind of connection that was real but unprovable, the specific texture of pressure applied by someone who understood how cities actually worked. Vivian read Prentice's report, folded it, and said, 3 weeks is manageable. He's going to keep doing this, Caleb said. Every supplier, every contractor, every committee vote. Yes, she said. Until the water right lands on his desk. When is that? She looked at him. When he stopped being cautious. When he believes he's winning. She picked up the folded report and set it aside. He's not there yet. He's still measuring. Caleb looked at her. How do you know when someone stopped being cautious? They get generous, she said. People who think they've won start making magnanimous gestures, offering settlements, suggesting compromises that favor them but acknowledge the other side. She looked at the window. Graham will make an offer. When he does, that's when he thinks it's over. The offer came on the 14th of October. It arrived through Aldrich, a formal written proposal from Holloway's legal team suggesting a negotiated resolution to the boundary dispute. The terms were presented as reasonable. Vivian would accept the 1882 survey as the official boundary, relinquishing the disputed 40-yard parcel, including the creek frontage. In exchange, Holloway would withdraw his support for the informal inquiry into her estate management, facilitate the release of the school construction loan from the bank, and pay a one-time settlement of $3,000. $3,000 was not an insult. It was real money, carefully calculated to be just large enough that refusing it required justification. Aldrich brought the offer to the property on a Wednesday afternoon and laid it on the kitchen table with the expression of a man who had looked at it from every angle and had a professional opinion he was preparing to deliver. It's a reasonable offer, he said. Given the cost and duration of continued litigation, and given the pressure on your other interests, this resolves the dispute at a known cost rather than an uncertain one. Vivian looked at the document. Your recommendation? Aldrich hesitated for exactly 1 second, which told Caleb everything about what the hesitation cost him. Accept it, he said. The independent survey is strong, but courts are unpredictable. $3,000 in relief from the pressure campaign is concrete. The boundary, in the end, is a parcel of land. Vivian nodded slowly, as if considering this very carefully. Thank you, Martin. Aldrich gathered his papers. He looked at Caleb briefly, in the way of a man who wasn't sure what role this person was playing, and had decided to remain professionally neutral about it. Then he left. The kitchen was quiet. Noah was in the main room making his way around the furniture with the purposeful furniture-assisted walking he'd been doing for the past 3 weeks. Not yet fully independent on his feet, but deeply committed to being mobile by any available means. Caleb looked at Vivian. She was looking at the offer document with an expression that was absolutely unreadable. Well, he said. Go get the portfolio, she said. He went and got it from the desk drawer where she kept it, and brought it to the kitchen table and set it beside the settlement offer, and she opened it and took out the water right document and placed it next to Holloway's $3,000 proposal, and looked at both of them together for a long moment. He doesn't know, she said. It wasn't a question. It had moved past being a question weeks ago. He doesn't know, Caleb confirmed. If he knew, this offer would not exist. He would not be settling. He would be pivoting his entire strategy toward acquiring the water right, which he cannot acquire without my agreement, which I would not give him. The mill doesn't work without the water right, Caleb said. The land doesn't serve his purpose without the mill. So his $3,000 settlement, Vivian said, is an offer to buy land worth considerably less to him than he has spent the last 8 months pretending it is worth. She looked at the two documents side by side. And if I accept it, he will discover the water right 6 months from now when he goes to file for mill construction permits, and he will be faced with the choice of coming back to negotiate for it or abandoning the mill project entirely. At which point he'll be negotiating from a much weaker position, Caleb said. At which point I will be the one deciding what a fair price is, she said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up Holloway's settlement document and set it aside, face down, and picked up the water right instead. I'm going to Aldrich's office tomorrow morning, she said. With this, I want him to file it with the land recorder's office and send a copy to Holloway's lawyer with a cover note explaining that given the water rights implications for the disputed parcel's commercial value, we find the proposed settlement figure significantly inadequate, and will be proceeding with the survey dispute through the courts. Caleb watched her face while she said this. There was no triumph in it. That was the thing he'd come to and understand about Vivian over these months. She didn't perform her emotions for an audience, even an audience of one. What was on her face was something more like resolution. The particular expression of a person who has been waiting a long time to do a necessary thing and is now doing it. He's going to be angry, Caleb said. Yes. He's going to feel outmaneuvered. He was outmaneuvered, she said, by a water right document that's been in a drawer for 11 years and a groundskeeper who asked the right question about a mill. She looked at him. He's welcome to be angry. Angry and wrong is still wrong. She went to Aldrich's office the following morning. Caleb stayed at the property with Noah and spent the day splitting firewood for winter, work that required no thought and produced a satisfying and concrete result, which was what he needed. He thought about the question he hadn't asked yet and hadn't asked because he didn't know what the answer would be. And not knowing the answer meant the question had the quality of a thing you could lose by asking it too soon. He'd had that feeling before, on the job, a moment where you knew that the next action was irreversible, and once you committed, the structure either held or it didn't, and standing there before the commitment was a kind of safety that you gave up the moment you moved. He kept splitting wood. Aldrich sent Holloway's lawyer the letter with the water right document attached on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Prentice came back from the city with a single piece of information. Holloway had canceled his Friday meetings, all of them, which was, Prentice observed with the flat delivery of a man who had learned to let information speak for itself, not something Graham Holloway had done in living memory. He's recalculating, Vivian said when Prentice told her. Or he's furious, Caleb said. Both, she said. In his case, those aren't mutually exclusive. Holloway's response took 12 days. When it came, it was not through his lawyer. It was a personal letter, handwritten, delivered to the property by his driver. Vivian read it at the kitchen table while Caleb was eating breakfast and Noah was doing his furniture circuit in the main room. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the table for a moment. He's withdrawing, she said, from the boundary dispute, from the inquiry into my estate, from all of it. She paused. He says he has reconsidered the scope of his interests in the North District and has determined that the projected costs no longer align with anticipated returns. Caleb set down his coffee. That's everything. That's everything, she confirmed. And the school loan? He says he will speak to the bank manager. She picked up the letter again. He phrases it as a gesture of neighborly goodwill, as if the last 8 months were a misunderstanding between people who simply had different views of the same property line. She set it down again. He is a remarkable man in his way. He loses and reframes the loss as a considered position before anyone's had time to notice. Can he still cause problems? He can always cause problems, she said. He's Graham Holloway. But the mill project is over without the water right, and he won't get the water right from me at any price I haven't chosen, and he knows it now. The particular problem he's been causing for the last 8 months is over. She looked at the letter one more time, and then she said it very deliberately in the same face-down posture she'd given the settlement offer, as if that was how she disposed of documents she was finished with, and she picked up her coffee. Caleb watched her. How do you feel? He asked. She looked at him. The question seemed to catch her slightly off guard, which was one of the ways you could tell it was a genuine question rather than a social one. Tired, she said, after a moment. I feel tired. I thought I would feel something else, but mostly I feel tired. That's what winning actually feels like, he said. I've heard. The brief look she gave him then was the look he meant when he'd told her she should laugh more. Not the laugh itself, just its antechamber. The thing that happened in her eyes before her face decided what to do about it. Apparently so, she said. The school frame went up the following month, in the second week of November, on a cold, clear day that was exactly the kind of Colorado autumn day that made you understand why people came to this part of the country and stayed. The bank loan had been released without ceremony. The timber supplier had restored his delivery schedule with a brief letter of apology that cited a clerical error which had not in fact been a clerical error. And the construction crew that had been delayed through Holloway's interference went to work with the accumulated energy of men who'd been sitting on a job and were ready to be doing it. Vivian was there for the frame raising. So was Caleb, with Noah on his hip, the boy bundled in his winter coat and hat, watching the timber go up with the focused attention he brought to all large moving things. There were other people there too, families from the North District, workers from the mining operations east of the city. A handful of people Caleb didn't know who had apparently heard about the school and come to see it taking shape. An older woman named Clara, whose husband worked at the mill on the south side, brought a pie and set it on the wagon tailgate, as if there was an obvious place for a pie in this situation, which turned out to be correct. Two men from the Consolidated Mine, the same operation that had let Caleb go in December, were there with their wives, and one of them recognized Caleb and shook his hand and said something about the school that was simple and genuine, the way things are when people mean them. Vivian stood at the edge of the site and watched the frame go up piece by piece, and her face had the quality it had in the garden when the tomatoes came in. The satisfaction of someone who wasn't sure the thing was going to work and is still slightly surprised that it has. Caleb stood beside her. Noah pointed at the frame with one mittened hand and said something definitive and incomprehensible. "He approves," Caleb said. "He approves of everything structural," Vivian said. "He's been watching you work since he could sit up. He thinks buildings going up is the natural order of things." They watched the frame for a while. "I've been thinking," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "You've been thinking for about 6 weeks." He looked at her. "You noticed." "You split enough firewood to heat the property for 3 winters," she said. "Something was on your mind." He looked back at the frame. The crew was setting the roof joists now, the work moving with the steady, practiced rhythm of people who knew what they were doing and had stopped showing off for the audience. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said, "for the property. The South Field wants more than reseeding. It wants proper pasture management, which means a fence line and probably some cattle, which is a bigger undertaking than anything I've done here so far." He paused. "And the school is going to need a groundskeeper once it's built, someone who knows the property." "I thought about that," she said. "I'd like to stay," he said. "Not just as groundskeeper, or not only as that." He stopped. He looked at Noah, who was still pointing at the frame with the authority of a small person who has identified something important. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like either too much or too little." "Then say it plainly," she said. "You're better at plain than you think." He looked at her. "I'm not the same person I was in February," he said. "I don't just mean the job or the cottage. I mean something happened here that I didn't expect, and I've been careful about it because I have Noah to think about, and because you have everything to lose from a mistake, and because the last time I loved someone, I lost her, and learning to be prepared for that again is not something that happens quickly." He stopped. "But I'm not going to keep not saying it because I'm afraid of the answer." Vivian was very still beside him. "I'm not afraid of you leaving," he said. "I'm afraid of wasting the time when you're here." Around them, the construction crew kept working. Clara was cutting her pie on the wagon tailgate. The 2 miners from the Consolidated were talking to someone Caleb didn't recognize. Noah had switched from pointing at the frame to pointing at the pie, with a strong sense of priority. Vivian was quiet for long enough that he began to feel the specific cold of a person who has said the irreversible thing and is waiting to learn what it costs. Then she said, "I have been alone a long time." "I know." "And I was not unhappy," she said. "I want you to understand that. I worked out how to be a complete person by myself, and I was not waiting to be rescued." "I know that too." "What I'm saying," she said more carefully, "is that when you knock on a door that's been closed for a long time, the person on the other side may take a moment, not because they don't want to open it." She looked at Noah, who had now decided the pie situation was urgent and was saying so at volume. But because they've forgotten, they didn't have to live without it. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and the composure was there because it was always there. It was built into her, but underneath it was the other thing. The thing he'd seen in the June sleet with the lamp between them, and in the kitchen at 4:15 in the morning when she didn't know he was awake, and at the frame raising just now when she didn't know he was looking. The real thing, undecorated. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I know." "No," she said. That's what made it possible to say. Noah, having determined that the adult conversation had gone on long enough without addressing the pie issue, grabbed Caleb's coat lapel with both hands and tugged with the full conviction of someone whose needs were clear and immediate and not being appropriately attended to. Caleb laughed. It came out surprised, the way his laughs usually did. He was not a person who laughed on purpose. Vivian smiled, And it was the real one, the full one, the one that changed her face. "The pie," she said. "The pie," he agreed, and they went to get some. Winter came properly in December, the way Colorado winters did. With commitment, without apology, dropping a foot of snow in 3 days, and following it with temperatures that made going outside a negotiation. The cottage was warm. The drainage held. The roof held. The firewood, 3 winters' worth, stacked against the north wall of the lean-to, held. The school was roofed and sided before the first hard freeze, which was the thing that mattered most before spring, and it stood on the North District lot through the winter cold with the particular solidity of a building that had been built properly by people who meant it to last. Caleb moved his few remaining things from the cottage into the main house in December, not as an announcement, but as a practical fact. The cottage was farther from the school site he was helping manage through construction. The main house was larger and warmer, and Noah had been sleeping in the small room off the kitchen since June anyway. He brought the coffee pot with the broken spout. He brought Margaret's sewing basket. He hung both of them in the kitchen where they could be seen without being in the way, and Vivian saw them and did not say anything about them, which was exactly right. He told her about the coffee pot one evening, about Margaret's laughter when he'd given it to her, the promise to fix the spout he'd never kept. Vivian listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without performing her listening. When he finished, she said, "She sounds like someone who made rooms larger." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." "I'm not that," she said. It wasn't self-deprecation. It was the plain accuracy she applied to everything. "I make rooms the right size." "I know," he said. "That's what I needed." She looked at him. "Both things can be true," he said. "Missing her and being here. They're not the same currency." She nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I spent 2 years feeling that my husband and my son were accusations against whatever happiness I found afterward. It took time to understand that keeping them didn't require refusing everything else." They sat with that for a moment, the weight of it and the lightness of it, both present, neither canceling the other. Noah had fallen asleep in the chair in the corner, which he did sometimes when the room was warm and the conversation had been going on at the level of adult murmur that he apparently found soporific. He was sprawled with the total physical abandon of a sleeping toddler, one arm hanging off the chair arm, face turned toward the window. "He's going to fall," Vivian said. "He never falls," Caleb said. "I don't know how, but he never falls." They watched him for a moment. "He has your stubbornness," Vivian said. "He has his mother's timing," Caleb said. "She always fell asleep at exactly the point when I needed someone to talk to." Vivian looked at him. "That was a joke," he said. "I know," she said. "It was a good one." They married in the spring, when the ground was soft again and the school was nearly finished, and the south field had been properly fenced, and 4 cattle were grazing on pasture that had been weeds 8 months before. The ceremony was small. Aldrich as a witness, Prentice, Clara from the frame raising who had become a regular presence at the property in the way of people who show up once with a pie and then simply continue being there, and a handful of the families from the North District who had become connected to Vivian through the school project. Caleb had asked Noah's opinion on the matter, which he understood was a symbolic gesture given that the boy was 14 months old, and his primary opinions concerned food and moving objects. But he'd asked anyway, one morning, because it seemed like the kind of thing a father should do even when the answer was going to be delivered in toddler and require translation. Noah had listened to the question with the serious attention he brought to all propositions and then said something at length that contained no words. Caleb could identify, but had the unmistakable cadence of agreement. "That's what I thought," Caleb said. "It was not a perfect life." He wanted to be clear about this, in the way that people who have survived hard things often need to be clear about it, because the sentimentality of happy endings tends to erase the texture of what actually happened and replace it with something smoother and less true. The boundary survey went through the courts anyway. Holloway had withdrawn his opposition, but legal processes have their own momentum, and the formal resolution took another 8 months of procedural work before the east parcel boundary was officially recorded at Ira Bent's measurement. Aldrich billed them thoroughly for this, as was his right. The school had a difficult first winter. The teacher they'd hired, a young woman from Ohio named Pratt, was excellent at the job and moderately terrible at managing a wood stove, and the building was cold for the first 2 months until Caleb installed a better damper system and spent a Saturday afternoon teaching her how to use it. Several of the families in the North District were skeptical of the school in the beginning, not hostile but careful, in the way of people who have been told things were for their benefit before, and discovered the benefit was more complicated than advertised. The enrollment was thin through February and March, and then built steadily from April onward, as word moved through the district in the particular way it did in communities where trust was slow and referrals were everything. Vivian never stopped managing her estate with the same clear-eyed rigor she'd always applied to it. She did not soften into domesticity, which was not something Caleb would have wanted or she would have permitted. She sat at her desk with her papers in the mornings and made her decisions and fought her fights. And the difference was that she came home to a house where the stove was lit and the kid was fed and someone had done the work that needed doing, and that was what she'd missed without knowing she'd missed it. Not rescue, but accompaniment. Caleb did not stop working with his hands. The property gave him enough to do that this was never in question, and the school gave him additional work as its unofficial groundskeeper and general problem solver, a role he drifted into without anyone formally assigning it to him, which was how he preferred things. He was not a man who needed acknowledgement. He needed work that mattered, and could see that it mattered, and the school gave him both. He planted an orchard on the north side of the property, in the cleared space where the old cottonwoods had come down in the June storm. He planted it in the early spring of the year after the wedding, apple trees mostly, a few pear, and one stubborn cherry tree that took 3 years to show any inclination to fruit. He planted it partly because the land wanted something planted on it, and partly because orchards took years to come into themselves, which meant committing to a future, which meant knowing that the future was somewhere you intended to be. Noah helped plant the first apple tree, in the specific way a 14-month-old helps plant a tree. By sitting in the hole before it was big enough and then moving the soil around afterward with the enthusiasm of someone who does not understand that the organization of soil matters. Caleb let him. Some things were more important than efficiency. Vivian kept the dented tin. He found it in the main house kitchen one afternoon, years later, when Noah was old enough to be in school himself, and was attending Miss Pratt's morning class with the focused reluctance of a child who had opinions about sitting still. Vivian had placed the tin on the shelf above the kitchen window, where the light came through in the mornings, between a jar of dried herbs and a small, smooth rock that Noah had brought home from the creek and declared important. He picked it up and held it, feeling its dents and its weight, and thought about Walter Briggs and his red face and the specific geometry of that moment in February 1888. A cold store, a baby's pale fist, a woman in a dark wool coat who was not looking at him with pity. She came into the kitchen while he was holding it. "You kept it," he said. "Of course I kept it." He looked at her. "Why, of course?" She took the tin from him and looked at it the way she looked at things she had thought about carefully. "Because I want to remember what it cost," she said. "Not the money. The other thing. The cost of watching someone be ground down for something that wasn't his fault, in front of people who did nothing." She put it back on the shelf. "I want to remember that feeling so I don't mistake comfort for goodness." She straightened the tin on the shelf. "It's very easy, when you have enough, to confuse having enough with deserving it." He looked at the tin on the shelf, small and dented and unremarkable, sitting between the herbs and the rock that Noah had deemed important. "It was a bad tin," he said. "It was a terrible tin," she agreed. "I've never been happier to pay for anything in my life." He put his arm around her, and she let him, and they stood in the morning kitchen with the light coming through the window and the sound of the property outside. The cattle, the distant sound of children at the school, a bird in the orchard trees that were beginning, that spring, to finally look like what they were always going to be. There was a thing Caleb had understood by then that he hadn't understood in February 1888 when he walked into a store with his last coins and his son and his pride all pressed together into the same small space. He had understood it the way you understand most true things, not in one moment but accumulated, one day laid on another, until the weight of them finally told you something. It was this: the difference between charity and a chance is not in the thing offered. It's in whether the person offering it is trying to reduce you or expand you, whether they hand you the thing and step back, or hand you the thing and stay. Vivian had not given him a handout in that store. She had given him a direction and then walked in it alongside him, and those two things look identical from the outside and are completely different from the inside. And most of what goes wrong between people is the confusion of one for the other. He had needed the chance. He had worked the chance into something. The work had been his. The chance had been hers. And what had grown between them was neither debt nor gratitude, but the third thing, the harder thing, the thing that required two people to look at each other honestly over a long enough period of time that the performance falls away, and what remains is either enough or it isn't. It was enough. More than enough, and not without cost, and imperfect in all the ways that real things are imperfect, and his. Noah came home from school at noon with mud on his boots and an opinion about long division that he expressed at length through lunch, and the orchard was there when they looked out the window, growing into what it was going to be. And the dented tin sat in the morning light on the kitchen shelf, and outside the school that Vivian had built stood on the North District lot, full of children who needed somewhere to go. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but plans were the things you made before you understood what you were actually capable of, and what you were capable of, it turned out, was determined less by your circumstances than by what you did the moment someone else's need arrived in front of you, and the easier thing was to look away. Vivian had not looked away in February 1888. Caleb had not looked away in June when the tree was falling. They had both, in their separate moments of choice, turned toward the harder thing, and the harder thing had turned out to be the better one, which was not a guarantee that was ever printed on the label, but was, in their experience, true. The orchard would take another year to fruit properly. They could wait.